Hello again, Dan Alasso with History for Today. And this morning I want to talk about the second chapter of Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States. And this one is called Drawing the Color Line. This is the first of Zinn's chapters to deal with what Zinn calls that combination of inferior status and derogatory thought that we call racism. And it's interesting that not all the racism applies to African Americans. Zinn begins this chapter by mentioning that one of the complaints against the governor of the Virginia colony, Sir Thomas Smith, was that he had, quote, forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who, being taken again, were put to sundry deaths, as by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel. This is another really interesting element of the kind of untold story of poor folks' preference for life among the Indians that throughout the colonial world is countered again and again by narratives of captivity and redemption, which I'll talk about some other time. By 1619, when the first slaves were delivered to Virginia, over 1 million enslaved people had already been shipped to the Caribbean and to Spanish America. Zinn uses this point to suggest that it was very unlikely, even if their legal status was not completely yet one of chattel slavery, that these captives were thought of as anything but slaves. Zinn counters the excuse sometimes made by apologists of slavery that the Africans did it to themselves too, by describing how slavery was different in Africa. I do this also in my own classes. But this is only half of the response, I think. The other half might really be, how does saying they did it too make what the colonists did any less evil? The early slave trade was dominated, Zinn says, by the Dutch and then by the English. The Spanish granted the asiento to the English South Sea Company in 1714, though. So by the time of the American Revolution, the English were probably the main slavers. Zinn says by 1795, Liverpool had more than 100 ships carrying slaves and accounted for half of all the European slave trade. But then again, by 1807, it was over. So there's probably a big story there that it would be valuable to look more into. And as an aside, according to Alan Taylor, because slaves were typically worked to death very quickly and then replaced on sugar plantations, by the time of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence's talk about all men being created equal, there were more living slaves in North America than there were in the Caribbean. 1/5 of the total population of the rebel colonies was enslaved. Zinn says that Africa lost 50 million people during this period of Atlantic slavery. He quotes a long passage showing that the Catholic Church in Spanish America was fine with slavery, and that even priests kept slaves. Then, returning again to colonial Virginia, he described the punishment, sound whipping, that was imposed on a white man in 1630 for sleeping with a black woman. Zinn also points out that lists of servants very early on enumerated blacks separately from whites, and that a law passed in 1639 to provide weapons for colonists so they could fight the Indians specifically excluded blacks. So it seems like racialized slavery began much earlier than we may sometimes imagine. This doesn't mean that everybody was racist, however. Zinn cites historian Kenneth Stamp's description of black and white servants behaving toward one another as equals and being, quote, remarkably unconcerned about the visible physical differences. He mentions that in 1691, Virginian law threatened to banish any white man or woman, being free, who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free. This, of course, would have been after Bacon's Rebellion. The expansion of slavery in colonial America was very rapid. By 1700, in Virginia, there were 6,000 slaves, 1/12 of the population. By 1763, there were 170,000 slaves, about half the population. Zinn mentions that slaves always resisted and often ran away, sometimes even rebelled, despite the fact that that was nearly suicidal. He doesn't mention that many slave revolts, though, which is unfortunate. I have a slide in my lecture that I gave today that includes a dozen revolts, from the 1526 San Miguel de Guadalupe rebellion in Spanish Florida that was victorious, to the 1791 Haitian Revolution that was also victorious. I think this is useful to drive the point home that resistance was common and was sometimes successful. Zinn does mention that Herbert Aptheker, in his book American Negro Slave Revolts, counted about 250 instances where a minimum of 10 slaves joined in a revolt or a conspiracy. At the time of the 1712 New York Revolt, which Zinn does talk about, enslaved people made up about 10% of the population, the highest percentage in the northern colonies. By the time of the supposed conspiracy of 1741, there were 10,000 whites in the city, Zinn says, and 2,000 black slaves. No wonder the white paranoia resulted in such brutality, in which, Zinn says, 2 white men and 2 white women were executed, 18 slaves were hanged, and 13 slaves were burned alive. It might be interesting to look more closely at this, especially if the executed whites were allies of the blacks, if not co-conspirators, because it's doubtful that there really was an actual conspiracy. Then Zinn does reach Bacon's Rebellion, during which, in Edmund Morgan's words, there are hints that the two despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. In Bacon's Rebellion, one of the last groups to surrender was a mixed band of 80 Negroes and 20 English servants. To drive a wedge between these servants and slaves and prevent them from acting as a class, Morgan goes on to say, in 1705, a law was passed requiring masters to provide white servants whose indenture time was up with 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, and a gun, while women servants were to get 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings. Also, 50 acres of land. Wealthy Virginians could afford this because they were making such huge profits on their enslaved Africans. As James Madison boasted to a British visitor shortly after the American Revolution, he could make $257 on every Negro in a year and spend only $12 or $13 on his keep. This is the first, but I'm sure not the last time, that Zinn will talk about slavery and the white treatment of black people in America. But for now, I hope people found that interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.